Well, welcome everyone to the virtual world of the East Side Freedom Library. I'm Peter Ratcliffe, the co-executive director, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon's conversation with several Starbucks workers who have organized their stores and are involved in different ways with the larger campaign to unionize Starbucks across the country. We have, over the last 3 or 4 months, had some great programs through the East Side Freedom Library with workers who are organizing, half-price bookstore workers, Amazon workers, media and entertainment workers. There's a lot going on. It was interesting this past week that the issue bubbled up into the media that the nurses at the Mayo Clinic-owned hospital in Mankato had voted to decertify their union, and the media was pretty interested in that. I think it's important to keep reminding people that there's a big wave going in the direction of unionization. And it's particularly exciting for us at the East Side Freedom Library to see young people taking the lead in these campaigns. So the plan for today is we will hear from three Starbucks workers, Gracie Naira, Maxwell Chang, and Emily Mahoney. And they will each tell us a bit about their stories. And then I might exercise the prerogative of the chair to ask a couple of questions myself. And then we'll go to the audience and your questions. And I would ask you to keep your microphones off in case, as is the case here at my house, you have an obstreperous dog who might want to participate in the conversation. We want to keep them out, unfortunately. And we will move to a phase where I want to encourage you to turn on your videos and turn on your mics and let us see everybody and hear from you. But let's start with our presenters today, our panelists. And I'm going to ask Gracie Naira to start first, please.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Gracie. I use she, they. I'm originally from San Antonio, Texas, and I currently work at the Starbucks location at 300 Snelling. I started with Starbucks in 2017 while I was still in undergraduate school at Macalester College, and have since worked at Starbucks both in Texas and in Minnesota. I would say that those experiences at different stores have really shaped my sense of urgency and my feeling that unions are a necessity at Starbucks throughout the nation. While I was in Texas back in 2019, wages for baristas were around $9, $9.50 an hour. We weren't scheduled last tens as per Starbucks policy for 8-hour shifts, and we would be regularly scheduled 9-hour shifts. That would be the condition that would allow us the last 10 in our manager's eyes. And worker burns injuries were very disregarded, and there was a real sense of futility amongst workers in Texas, mostly young. At the time, I was probably 22, 23. And we had contacted regional managers, we had contacted Starbucks, and there was just really a sense that they were going to let this manager kind of get away with that. And none of us really knew what it would mean to escalate and get involved with the National Labor Relations Board, or really understood our rights as workers. And so moving back to Minnesota and, being here with the onset of the pandemic and during the uprising in the wake of George Floyd's murder, and kind of only being allowed to go to and from work, really crystallized and isolated this sense of responsibility to take ownership and to, argue for our rights and really figure out how to make that workable. Because we always knew, at least people that I've worked with, that Starbucks wasn't an ideal job, but there was this sense that you would be able to get away from it or do something else. And when that became the only place to go, it was, oh, okay, this is this is the place that we have to, fight for ourselves in, because that's all there is left right now. So I'm really excited to, hear my coworkers' stories, show solidarity with one another, and talk about what we want to see for the future.
Thanks, Gracie. Maxwell Chang, you want to pick up?
Sure, yeah. Hey everybody, I'm Max Chang. I use he, him. I'm originally from Ithaca, New York, and I also work at the 300 Snelling location. Um, I started in Starbucks in June of last summer. So right after I had moved back to Minnesota after taking classes from home after being kicked out of dorms for the pandemic. So that context was especially important for pushing me towards unionizing. Obviously, as Gracie said, like work was all you could do, and staying safe and healthy at work was a huge priority of mine. Um, yeah, and when I was hired, there were lots of promises about how our store was going to look, sort of as a safe space for marginalized communities. And I don't know, as I started working in my first couple weeks, don't necessarily think I felt that those promises like being backed up by actions. And so yeah, starting to have conversations about that sort of thing on the floor with my coworkers. We started realizing that we had similar politics, a lot of similar ideas about how our workplace could improve. And then the Buffalo stores filed a petition to unionize, and that really like lit a spark under us. I feel like from there, everything moved really fast. Some members of our store reached out to Starbucks Workers United, and from there, like it was form an organizing committee and start the conversations about the union. And yeah, I'm really thankful that I've been able to be included in this process and of all the people I've met through it. Yeah, that's sort of my story.
Thank you, Max. Emily?
Hi, my name is Emily Mahoney. I use she, they pronouns. I've worked for Starbucks for about 5 years now, and I've worked for 3 stores during that time, all of which have been in Minnesota. But essentially 2 years ago or something, a Starbucks friend of mine and I would kind of go, haha, what if we unionized? And we did that for a couple of years until we heard about Buffalo. And then he came into work one day with a mischievous look on his face and he said, what if we actually did it? And so we started also kind of having the same conversations with folks where we were like, hey, what would you want to see different about Starbucks? And a lot of it was, folks would have issues with like, I don't know, how things were being run, and they would bring that up to management, and then management would just kind of go, well, that's the kind of the way it is. It's always been like that. And we would go, well, what can we do to change that? And they'd go, that's just the way it is. And I think after enough of, that's just the way it is, and people were like, all right, well, if you want to change it, we will. So that's kind of where we're at. And it's been so cool to see like the whole community come out and support us and stuff. We had a sip-in recently where we invited people to come to our store to show support for our union, and had like a really great turnout for that. And I know we're planning another event in this upcoming week on Sunday and Monday where we're asking folks to come out to the store as well at any time. So we've already heard a bunch of folks that are really excited about it. So it's been really cool to see people come together.
And where is your store, Emily?
Oh, I'm sorry. I work at 47th and Cedar in Minneapolis.
Thank you. We need to know where we should be coming. Yeah. So, as a old labor historian, I have often worried about how the lessons and stories of labor history are not being taught in the schools. As the percentage of the workforce that is unionized shrinks, I've been worried that stories within families are not going to be passed on intergenerationally. So I wonder if each of you would say a little bit about, where did you get this idea about unionizing? And it had to be something there before the spark from Buffalo or in connection with the spark from Buffalo. Were there union stories in your families, your neighbors? How did you get ideas about unions to begin with? So, Emily, you want to start?
Yeah, I'll start. So for me, my grandpa was actually a union president. I don't know a lot of the specifics, but that was kind of where I first got my ideas, is like growing up and hearing stories from him about his union and his union experience, and then going, that sounds kind of cool. I don't know a lot about it, and then doing some Googling. So that's kind of how I learned about unions, is from my grandpa.
Great, thank you. Max?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I'd say for one, like it's come up in podcasts I've listened to, like Stuff You Missed in History Class, or just general history podcasts in which the labor movement comes up, and seems very important and appealing. But also actually in a class at McAllister, I have a professor who used to be a graduate student at University of Santa Barbara and was very involved in sort of trying to organize grad student and student workers. So yeah, he and I have exchanged a lot of information about unions, and he's really pushed me through this whole process to stay involved and get it over the line at our store.
Great, thank you. And Gracie?
I had actually never really thought about unions very much, but at least ideologically. So my dad is a theologian, particularly like within liberation theology. And I was just really raised with this idea that, you should always be like enacting any value that you have. And when we started getting vocal, in 2020 about COVID and sort of looking into what our rights were, that all of that just kind of fell in line, because it felt like something that we could be doing.
Great. I wonder, Gracie, did you grow up hearing about a woman named Emma Tenayuka?
The name sounds familiar.
Uh-huh. So she was an organizer of largely Latina pecan shellers in San Antonio in the 30s. And if you were ever to take a labor history course with me, you would learn about Emma Tenayuka. But I'm sure that there are people in your neighborhood and in your network back home in San Antonio who know about her. And there should be statues and plaques and signs. There are all kinds of people whose stories, as Max was saying, were typically not in the history courses, unfortunately. One of the things that's been interesting about the organizing that's been going on in Starbucks is how much of it, and I think also the organizing in the bookstores that's going on locally, and how much of it is worker to worker, and how little of it is professional organizers who come in like out of some 1940s movie and blow into the workplace and whisper in people's ears. And so I wonder if you guys would say a little bit about the kind of worker to worker conversations that have gone on around the idea of unionizing. Why don't we start with Max this time? Max?
Yeah, I think that's totally a correct characterization. I believe like the Starbucks Workers United in the Midwest has like less than 10 or around 10 like employees. So obviously they can't be covering everything and getting into every store. So it really has depended on networks of baristas and shift supervisors just having conversations on the floor with each other, making connections with people who they used to work with at other stores. Yeah, I know, like in our store, it was one of us who reached out to the organizer and said, "Hey, I heard you may be doing something over at 47th and Cedar. Like, can we get involved in this?" And from there, it was like, "Sure, now let's put it back on you. It's time to go talk to your coworkers." And from there, it literally was just on the floor if you're hanging outside of work, like maybe you subtly bring it up, talking about some grievances you had with scheduling. Like, hey, there's a potential way we can change this. Like, how do you feel? And then once you get the like, okay, this is I'm interested in this, it's like next step is like get the union card signed, right? So it really is that worker to worker conversation. I'd say vast majority of the conversations we had to convince people were worker to worker.
Great, thank you. I mean, it makes me wonder about nouns and verbs like organizers and organizing, and, is the organizer really doing the organizing, or, coming in and essentially sanctioning what the workers are already doing? Gracie, you want to come in on this?
Yeah, I think what's interesting is sort of the difference between like in-person conversations and organizing versus like virtual and still navigating like those different terrains. I find that it's been a lot more effective to like take the time in the workplace, or spending time with like one or two people. We already have like a work relationship, in many cases, and a friendship that sort of creates the foundation for like, okay, what's up with work lately? Are we doing this? And sometimes even within the store level, like trying to get everyone to plug into like a union group chat isn't as effective as like the palpable energy of being on the floor together. Whereas a lot of those like digital interfaces have been really useful in connecting on the store to store level, where people will like share updates, what's happening at Mall of America, what's happening at St. Anthony, stuff like that. So I think it's going to be really interesting moving forward as well. How do those networks of communication kind of grow, and if we notice any other trends? And yeah.
Thank you. Emily?
Yeah, I think Gracie and Max did like such a great job of like explaining how it all went. We had like a really similar experience at our store as well, with like a really interesting point that Gracie brought up was like the friendship aspect. And I think that's something that's like really unique to Starbucks, and something that really helped us at our store along the way is that we're all kind of friends with each other. So it was really easy to be like, hey, how would you feel about unionizing? Here's some things that we could potentially change. And it's easy too to get people on board with things that affect other people, if that makes any sense. So that like, I don't know, it got a lot easier to work people up the more that we talked.
I've gotten the impression from talking with the three of you that there's turnover, and some of the turnover is people move from store to store. And so what kind of role has the turnover played in either or both, giving you the challenge of new people come on the job? Have you figured out like somebody in the team is responsible to talk to that new worker and explain that there's unionizing going on in this workplace, and why? And or do people carry the story to other stores if they get transferred? How does that moving around and conversing with people new to the scene, how does that work? Emily, if you would go ahead.
Yeah, I think the high turnover does make it a little extra interesting because you have to constantly recruit new people. But I think most folks find out that we're a union store and then transfer because of that, or they want to work there because we are a union store and they're interested in that. So that's been, I think, kind of interesting. I haven't seen it a lot from the other from the other side.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Gracie?
I think our store has examples of both. We had someone who switched stores because of location and commuting, and that store that partner transferred to had actually just filed. And so that partner was going to be able to vote in yet another election, which is really cool. And then we've had a number of partners come in, and if they, I mean, Max can kind of speak to this. If they have a barista trainer, then they already kind of have a buddy that can talk to them about the union. So I'll turn it over to Max now.
Great. Go ahead, Max.
Yeah, so recently we had a new partner come in. We've had a couple, like three, I think. Two of them were already trained, but I had the pleasure of getting to train one of our new baristas, and that was like a perfect opportunity to talk about the union and make sure that they were aware that we're a union store. And like I I mean, we already kind of had some connections with them through just like friendships from high school in our store, but so we kind of knew what their politics were. But yeah, like that one-on-one time floor on the floor every day was like a really excellent opportunity to just chat about the union, like talk about what exactly our union's doing now that it's been certified. Yeah.
Listening to you, the three of you, takes me back to Emily's mention of her grandfather. And I learned from an old timer who used to say that he could walk into any workplace and know if it was a unionized workplace or not a unionized workplace, in how fast people worked, or how they related to their supervisors, or things that were kind of intangible, but you knew it. And so I want to ask you the kind of difficult question of how has everyday life on the job changed as your store became unionized? And Max, I see you nodding your head. You can go first.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting because obviously from the company's side, they don't want anything to change. They're acting like nothing is happening essentially. I mean at our store, I understand that around the country there's been a lot stronger pushback and union busting. I think because our store is very new and very small, we sort of didn't get the super intense like captive audience meetings and things like that. But otherwise, like it's from the managerial perspective, from the company's perspective, like everything they're doing is pretty much the same. Like they're still trying to make unilateral changes and such. But what we know because of the union is that now we have confidence that we can be protected against those things and that there is a big group of people to back us up if there is any retaliation. So I think that's super important. And just like with previous managerial situations, there was sort of like an air of fear about confronting the manager, sort of like a disbelief in ever getting a one-on-one meeting with the manager that was going to be productive. Whereas I think post-union, we're pretty confident that we can go sit down with the manager and have a serious conversation about policy, about scheduling. Yeah.
Thank you. Gracie?
I'm trying to think too about, I'm trying to compare between like the Texas store I worked at
Mhm.
and 300 Snelling. And I do think there's just a different type of like social like empowerment and responsibility that comes across in like the way that people stand even, or
Mhm.
um like the store in Texas was just very much like, I don't care about this being here. I will make a joke with my coworkers, and there were certainly, like work friendships there as well, but they were much more just like distractions from everything else. And being at work wasn't anything that anyone was considering. And I think that at 300 Snelling and even at another Minnesota store I worked at, there was just a different like sense of security that you could feel. Like people felt like they were kind of standing in their own bodies differently, much more present in some way. Not that anyone is really excited to make, their 800th Frappuccino in a day, by no means, but there is a certain type of, oh, I'm here. And that's really nice to see.
Mhm. Thank you. And Emily, anything you want to add to this?
Yeah, I think I hadn't thought about this before, but it is really interesting to think about the before and after, and how there's kind of like a just like a quiet solidarity between everyone, just because like folks know that we have each other's backs, and like if you get pulled into a meeting with the manager, it doesn't have to just be you all by yourself. Especially because a lot of the folks at my store are like 16 to 18. That can be
Wow.
like super intimidating to be like a 16-year-old being pulled into the back room with your manager who's like 30 years older than you and yelling at you. And now it doesn't have to just be you, it can be you and somebody else that's there to like look out for you, which I think shows.
Hmm. What I'm hearing from the three of you is very similar to what we heard from bookstore workers, that none of them yet had a contract, and yet the relations between workers and management were were already changing, and the workers felt that they could bring issues to management collectively, that they didn't feel before, and that they didn't think that they necessarily needed a formal union contract in order to bring these issues forward together. And I think that's really great. That's the dynamic that's emerging. Um, I wonder about so Emily, you've mentioned that there's a bunch of 16 to 18-year-olds in the store. Um, Here are the three of you who are all, have college degrees in your back pocket. And I'm sure that when you started college, you didn't tell your parents, I want to be a barista. Um, so, when we're hearing some in the media, when the media pays any attention, up to the energy in the labor movement, that a lot of this energy is coming from people with advanced educations. And um, I think this is a complicated question to deal with. Both, how did your education prepare you to do what you're doing now in terms of organizing? And how does what you're doing now in terms of organizing affect what you think you might want to do um, later in life? Emily, you want to start?
Yeah, absolutely. So my degree is in music business. Um, so my degree is kind of unique, but I think when I was in college, like what I really wanted to do was like booking shows. And I honestly, when I started working at Starbucks right after I graduated, I was like, ugh, like I'm never gonna get to use this like knowledge that I have, and it's come in handy in kind
Mm,
of surprising
mm,
ways. Just because, I mean, when you book a show, you have to, reach out to all these people, make sure that like you have all of these different resources gathered, and you have to promote it and make sure that people will come. And so that's actually ended up being kind of useful. And also just like convincing people to care about a band that I think is really cool. And now I just have to convince people that, they matter. And, you're worth fighting for and your rights are worth fighting for. And that's actually turns out not as hard to convince people of that as to convince people to go see a niche band.
Uh-huh. Great, thank you. And Gracie?
I went to college and was just so excited to be in college that my first 2 years just kind of looked probably a little wild in terms of transcript. But I ended up becoming a political science major. And I knew that I didn't want to go into like politics, but I was taking a lot of classes that were kind of about the formation of social movements. Some like philosophy courses that were trying to unpack culture, stuff like that. And that really tied in with, I don't know, my interest in just being or imagining other realities. I think I've often felt disconnected just from whatever timeline it is that we're in and wishing I had been born into a different one. So in many ways, I feel like organizing at Starbucks is kind of the perfect culmination of whatever I wanted my degree to be. And I'm much more emotionally fulfilled in that sense. It feels like a good marriage of studying and action. And I hope in the future I've become interested in a legal education, in acquiring more skill sets for organizing, and you might find me applying to law schools in the future. So we'll see.
Thank you. We need more good labor lawyers for sure. Max, what about you and your education and your experience of work?
Yeah, so I got my degree in geography at Macalester. And I think Gracie can speak to this as well as a Mac grad. Like, Macalester is a place where there's tons and tons of critical thought happening, like inside and outside of the classroom. It's a lot of debate. It's a lot of being very critical and taking a critical lens to things. But sometimes that's very limited to you sitting in a desk and being asked to be critical, with no involvement with the world around you. And I think like once I got to Starbucks and started working there and the union popped up, it seemed like sort of the perfect opportunity to like take all these critical lenses and all this stuff I had been learning while sitting atrophied in my room doing homework, like, and put it into action where you can be involved with people, and having conversations outside of like the formal setting. And I think related to that, like what I see myself doing in the future, I'm not entirely sure. But I truly do hope that it will be something around community, something around where I'm not, alone in a super formal setting, where I can bounce ideas off of other people, where we can work on projects together, and where there's just that underlying sense of solidarity that this union has taught me is so important.
Great, thank you. I wonder sometimes as a labor historian and someone who tries to be involved in the labor movement in the present, that I struggle with whether there is a labor movement. There are unions, there are organized workplaces, there is collective bargaining and grievance procedures. And I wonder if your experiences so far have made you feel like you're part of a labor movement, has impacted your curiosity and interest in what nurses or teachers or longshore workers or railroad workers or the issues that they're confronting. Do you feel like you're part of something more than what's happening at your store? Max, you want to start?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I personally think so. Yeah, I mean, obviously this summer alone, there's been a huge sort of shift in what's happening in the labor movement per se, but also like we had sort of a union drive just outside of our store one day, and we had visitors from like the St. Paul Teachers Union, Minneapolis Teachers Union, who were there congratulating us and say like, this is the good work, like you're part of the movement. And I think yeah, I truly believe that there is a movement. I think um responding to the conditions we're living in now like is definitely a driver of that. I think the pandemic was certainly a
Mhm.
catalyst there, as well as the racial justice and Black liberation movement. So yeah, I feel like it is a movement, and maybe a and not something that's separate from the history, right? Like maybe like a revival or a renaissance
Yeah.
almost.
Thank you. Gracie?
I'm having this visceral memory, like back in 2020, like stepping on the floor and being like, I cannot believe all the work that went into just like a weekend existing. And just having this like, will I ever understand how much pain and how many people were involved in that effort? And like, there's something really moving about that. And kind of to that generational spirit sense. I do feel really connected through time and yeah, space to something bigger than just the present day Starbucks, even though those are huge in and of themselves. And I think especially as we start talking about, you know, national contracts and things like that, there'll be a lot more opportunities to pull in and hopefully grow the contemporary moment.
Thank you. I don't know whether you were referring to one of my favorite books, The Folks Who Brought You the Weekend by Priscilla Marolo, which is, I think, one of the best first books to read about what the labor movement has been throughout American history. So, and then I have a dear friend, Ricardo Levins Morales, the Northland poster, and has a bumper sticker, The Folks Who Brought You the Weekend. And I believe Ricardo has said that that is the single best-selling bumper sticker that he had ever created. So it's a good mantra to hang on to. Emily, what about you and the labor movement?
Yeah, I think just kind of reiterating what Max and Gracie have already said, it does feel really cyclical, but on like an upward kind of spiral, if that makes any sense.
Yes.
Because I mean, you think back to even like the textile workers, and then it came back around in like the 60s, and now it feels like it's kind of coming back around again. So it's a lot of work, and it's pretty scary and exciting, and I don't know, I'm excited to see where it goes and where this spiral takes us.
Well, not to make a trite comment, but you really are, the three of you and the people that you work with, you're making history. And I think a big part of what we're trying to communicate through the East Side Freedom Library is that lots of people make history. They may not get a chapter in the book that becomes a textbook or on the test, but you are experiencing kind of now consciously that what you're doing is making history. And I think it's really exciting that you're doing that. And so I want to ask one more question, and then I'll shut up and we'll see what other people have to say or ask. And that is, again, hearkening back to the bookstore workers. who talked about how important their relationships with customers were. And I think there are old models about union organizing, and that may have been mostly organizing in mines and factories where people only interacted with the other people that they worked with. But bookstore workers and baristas interact with the public all the time on the job. So what role has that played in your organizing? Emily, would you like to start?
Absolutely. I mean, honestly, customers can basically make or break our whole day. So when you're nice to us and you leave a nice little tip, makes your day. If you're mean, breaks it. But I mean, I think it's been so cool to have customers come in and like express their support. So like we've had folks come in and they'll order a drink and they'll put their name as Union Yes or Union Strong, which I don't know, might seem kind of silly when you're doing it, but like whenever someone does that, I like stop what I'm doing, I take a picture, and I post it on my Instagram story with a bunch of little hearts all over it because I'm so excited. So things like that are, like I said, like when you tip your baristas, like that goes directly to the people who are making your drinks and who are being underpaid. So that's, you know, another like direct thing that customers do that really helps us. And then when we have events, like when we had our sip in, or when we're having our event this weekend, like just having people show up, even if it's like just for a little bit of time, or if you can't make it that day, coming the day before and saying, hey, I can't come tomorrow, but like wanted to express my support for you. That actually means a ton to us.
Thank you. Max?
Yeah, I think this question is super interesting in the context of Starbucks as a company in particular because of how much emphasis they put on like the customer as the core of the company. And it's a mixed bag, really. Like we've made wonderful friends and have great relationships with some of our customers. And then on the other hand, like there are customers who treat you as the coffee robot and like who feel very entitled towards your time and your well-being, like being upset if the store is closed because we have people out sick. Yeah. But overall, like, yeah, as Emily said, when people come in and show support through the union, like it just sends like an infectious wave of excitement throughout the whole floor, like pulling a ticket that says Union Strong, like, and going to show it to everybody, just feels wonderful. So yeah, I think there is a lot of potential for the customers to be a huge, huge part of the movement. And because Starbucks puts them at the forefront so much, they have a lot of sway in potentially influencing the company's actions towards the union. But it is really tough because I know at our store, like we get such a mixed bag of super, super pro-union people, people involved in other unions, organizers, politicians coming in to show support. And then there are the customers who are anti-union, who don't like what we've done to the store, who won't tip, possibly because we're a unionized store. I've overheard customers like say that they're glad we got sick because we unionized. So it's really tough. It's really like can go peaks and valleys, like as Emily said, like could make your day or just completely break it.
Thank you, Max. Gracie?
There have been a couple instances where people will like come in and then kind of whisper, they're like, hey, are you a store that unionized? And that's always really cool because it feels like you're just like, oh, are we both in on this? And then in some cases, they're like, they've been long-time members of the union in their respective workplace. In other cases, I've had a couple of like Amazon or Whole Foods employees come by, and then there's like a nice little kind of chiding back and forth. It's like, okay, when are you guys coming? Like, so it's nice to build that type of back and forth and have, you know, our union kind of be a foundation for that. But yes, sometimes there are customers who will just like make a beeline for the manager, or like are really chummy and want to like make anti-union comments. So I think it's going to be really interesting moving forward. But overall, I'd say, we feel the support from customers a lot.
Great. Thank you. At the risk of overstaying my welcome and taking up too much space, I do want to just tell one story. And Gracie has heard the story before, that 14 years ago, in 2008, a former McAllister student named Eric Foreman was trying to organize the Starbucks at the Mall of America, and he was fired for it. And Eric filed an unfair labor practice and won. And the regional labor board insisted that Starbucks give him his job back. And it so happened that that order came down at the time of the Republican National Convention in St. Paul in September of 2008. And a group of labor supporters held a rally at the light rail stop on Franklin. And the idea was Eric was going back to the mall for his first shift. And there was a rally to celebrate his victory. And then everyone who was there piled onto the light rail to go to the mall and have a latte with Eric when he worked his first shift back at the store. And there was a tremendous police presence in the Twin Cities during the Republican National Convention. And a group of cops in what we called Ninja Turtle costumes got on the train. And when the train got to the Mall of America, the cops blocked the doors and said, nobody's getting off here. You have to go back to the Franklin stop. And that was a hell of an education for the people. And there were non-involved citizens on the train who actually said, what about my right to shop? You're denying me my right to shop by not letting me get off the train. So it was a very special treat for me to introduce Gracie to Eric when he was in town a month or so ago. And he's gone on to be an organizer in New York City and is organizing a cooperative of livery drivers trying to create an alternative for themselves to Uber and Lyft in a market where buying taxi medallions makes it almost impossible for one to become, particularly for an immigrant, to become a cab driver. So, the seeds that Eric planted are blossoming with him in New York and are blossoming with you guys right here in the Twin Cities. And it's really great. So I'm going to try to shut up and move us to gallery view, and hope that those of you who are still with us might have comments or questions. We're a small enough group. I encourage you to turn on your camera unless you're in your pajamas or have other reasons to be on the down low. But let us see you. Please feel free to ask a question. So Tess, I'm going to read your question out of the chat. It sounds like you and your coworkers were very united. Did you hear any concerns or pushback about unionizing from your fellow workers? And has corporate's resistance had an impact, particularly with your fellow workers? Anyone want to grab that? Gracie, go ahead.
In relation to, okay, so Starbucks will pull out these posters. In this instance, it was information releasing new benefits that stores that were not unionized would be eligible for. And our parent union and some of our workers in our store had drafted a kind of like a counter information document that was outlining what was illegal about the document that Starbucks posted. And we did have a couple of partners express, like, yes, we understand that Starbucks is behaving in an illegal way. We understand that this like counter information sheet that, you know, the union had put out is, you know, articulating our rights. However, what does that mean for like the next 3 months? Because it's, you know, you can put out another sheet that says that these are our legal rights, but what does that actually mean if Starbucks is going to act illegally and we don't get the raises? Like, what are we doing tangibly other than just like, you know, informing and reasserting that Starbucks is illegal? And that was definitely a concern. And I think that's a concern that a number of us have had, or at least that I have had, in terms of, you know, kind of recalibrating the timeline, or what can be done on an actionable level. And I think that a lot of addressing those concerns has allowed us to consider March on the Bosses, reinforming Starbucks management of their like, in fact, their illegal practice. They can't make a unilateral change like that across the company without bargaining with us, and sort of taking those opportunities and those very legitimate fears, or just you know, wanting to make more money in a time when inflation is on the rise, and kind of use them as more momentum.
Emily and Max, anything you want to add to that?
I mean, just to kind of reiterate it, I mean, I think a lot of the concern with the folks at our store is, sure, it's illegal for Starbucks to do this, that, or the other thing, but that doesn't mean that they can't get away with it. So what are they going to be able to get away with this? You know, stuff like that. But yeah, that's all I got.
Mhm. Max, anything you want to add?
No, I think I'm good.
Great. Okay, thank you. Derek has raised his mechanical hand. Yes.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you, Peter, for the program, and thank you for the Eastside Freedom Library. It's a great institution. I feel like I should say I'm a longtime fan, first time caller.
And I was saying to Max that I'm a friend of Sandra Green, who teaches with you.
Oh yes.
And her son was a student of mine.
Right.
And
Oh,
it's
there are
doing
lots of
great
connections.
work.
Yeah,
And yes,
that's right.
yes.
And you know, Mary Wingard's an old friend of mine from grad school, so long time
Great.
fan. But also to just a word of thanks and appreciation for Gracie, Max, and Emily for sharing their stories with us today, but also for all the work they're doing. Right. Super important. So I had a question. I think Gracie, in your sort of her opening statement, referenced the sort of broader context, not just of COVID, but of the movements for racial justice.
Mhm.
And I was just a little bit curious about whether Gracie, Max, and Emily could talk a little bit more about how those movements may have informed their work in the union on one hand, but also how working and organizing in the union and their experience at Starbucks may help them think a little bit differently or more about those broader movements as well.
Great. Who wants to start? Gracie, go ahead.
I was an active protester back in 2020, also in 2021, and that was a lot of my initial experience with horizontal organizing. I live in South Minneapolis. I'm about a mile away from the former 3rd Precinct, and I think my location definitely influenced just the kind of spheres that were around me, in terms of lots of mutual aid, lots of neighbor to neighbor sharing, just a lot of navigating Discord, Signal, really figuring out what it meant to, do horizontal organizing. And a lot of that has transitioned over really well and is sort of a practice in sort of establishing those practices in a labor sphere. and trying to connect, what wins can be made on the contract level. Like, as we learn about bargaining, what are we allowed to bargain on, and how do we make racial justice a forefront or a part of that national contract? So those are experiences that are definitely informing, and I see, this much more as an extension of those experiences. Yeah.
Thank you. Max, anything you want to say to that?
Yeah, I was actually like living in upstate New York at the time of a lot of these protests. But yeah, I mean, obviously just seeing all of it happening in a place where I was going to school and then coming back to like really invigorated my desire to push for justice on all fronts. And I mean, I think it's very important as we move forward to integrate like the racial justice aspect to our organizing. Otherwise, what is the point really? Otherwise, we're not doing it correctly. And yeah, I mean, for me personally, also having conversations with people like Gracie, who on the floor, like who had experienced protesting firsthand there, and things like that helped a lot. Gracie, I don't know if you feel comfortable, but I'd love to hear you talk about Snarshall and what was going on there around that time, because I feel like that was a huge inspiration and something that we were able to bring into our store as some experience as well.
I can touch briefly upon that. So 2020, 2021, I was working at a different store, also in St. Paul, just north of the store we're at now. And Starbucks had a contract with the city and with the St. Paul Police Department to have a off-duty officer stationed at the drive-through for 3 hours a day, and was paid, I can't remember what the hourly was, but every day the shift supervisor would be giving at least $200 to the officer in cash. He would come in and we would write it out as Starbucks has a sheet where we have to log, if we take any cash out of the drawer, what are we using it for? And so it was supposed to be logged as like store supplies. And then we'd also have to pull out money for the scheduler. So we were paying the off-duty officer, but also whoever was in charge of putting them on the calendar to be there. Obviously in 2020, that was just, what are we doing? Also because of COVID, the standard peak hours at the drive-through were completely thrown off. So it might have made sense to have someone navigate traffic between, 6 a.m., 9 a.m. But with COVID, the drive-through was always bleeding out onto this major intersection that notoriously had accidents. I think there was a former Minnesota congresswoman who broke her wrist involved in some freak accident at this Starbucks drive-through. It's kind of famous locally. So around this time, long story short, there was some issue-based organizing around pushing Starbucks to look into alternatives to an officer to manage traffic there. And they did nothing for a whole year. 2021 rolls around. Dante Wright in Brooklyn Center is involved is killed in a police shooting. And that sort of reinvigorates our effort. We end up contacting our regional manager saying that we will not open the store unless Starbucks can present us with some alternatives or show that they're making moves on that process. And they come in the next day, they disinvite the officer, and they shut down the drive-through, which has never been reopened and is now becoming a patio. But what they proceed to do after that is begin to call all of the workers individually, basically asking us out about our political views, if we'll abide by Starbucks contracts, intimidating us. And a few of us ended up getting invited to open up this new store, which is the store I work at now. So there was definitely some union busting involved, even though we were never thinking of a union. And that's a whole saga. So yes.
Thank you. Emily, on connections with the racial justice uprising and
Yeah, I mean, I'll keep my bit short, but I think for me it was just very much I I wasn't like, I hadn't had a lot of experience in like being involved in protests and stuff. And so for me, especially with like the George Floyd protests and everything, I was like, how do I help? Like, how do I get involved? And so being able to like, I don't know, just go out and see other community members helping and like wanting to get involved did kind of lend itself to then wanting to fight for the people who were right next to me. So
Thank you. Catherine, did you mean to raise your hand? Maybe not. Yes, Catherine?
That was a mistake. That's
That
all
was a
right.
mistake. So as a longtime teacher, I got really bad at reading students' body language, and because I was desperate to call on people. I did want to mention that 2 weeks ago, Eastside Freedom Library hosted an event with a young labor historian from Toronto named Jenny Carson, who has a new book out about African-American women laundry workers in Harlem and their efforts to organize in the 30s and 40s. And much of the book was about their struggles with the existing union establishment and hierarchy and bureaucracy. And what made the whole conversation so special was that she had brought with her a woman who was 104 years old, who was part of that organizing in the 30s. And we were all just, I feel like I got inspired 2 weeks ago by somebody 103, and now I'm being inspired today by people in their 20s. It's not bad. Anyone else? What do we have here? Maddie, do you want to ask this yourself, Maddie, or do you want to make me read this? Please.
I can read it.
Please.
Yeah, you guys talked a little bit about how union support has moved from store to store. And I was wondering what you guys would like to see in terms of kind of continued growth in the Twin Cities, and then also in terms of at other stores, and then also, I guess, with other unions and what solidarity might look like.
Great, thank you. Max?
I can start, yeah. I mean, it's not fully like planned out and official yet, but we are, someone from our organizing committee, Lola, is working on an event in August where we plan on, called a clean play is the nickname for it, where we sort of plan on having a bunch of people sign up from already unionized stores and then loading up cars and just driving to as many non-unionized stores in the area as possible and just starting organic conversations with baristas at those stores, and just gauging interests, like giving them our contact information, getting their contact information so we can be the ones to reach out to them. Yeah, so things like that are things to look forward to in the future, just sort of. And if customers would be willing to, like non-baristas would be willing to go to their store if it's not unionized and maybe start a little conversation with the barista, that would be super helpful as well. Yeah, so sort of just like really getting on the ground and getting into these stores, gauging interests, bringing up the topic, and seeing what that can do.
Thank you. Gracie, I know you said before we came on the air that you're participating in conversations in the union about developing a national agreement with Starbucks. Can you share a little bit about that?
Yes. So as of right now, Starbucks has 205, or Starbucks Workers United has 205 unionized stores. Many more stores have filed, but as of right now, that means there's somewhere between 4,100 and 4,700 unionized partners. And something that was integral to getting those elections was making sure that Starbucks couldn't prematurely make the bargaining unit across the region as opposed to store by store. So there were a number of hearings just to make sure that stores could vote individually, internally within themselves. And now it's kind of reaching the point where there's so many that if Starbucks were to respond to every single like bargaining request individually, it would be logistically difficult for all the unionized stores to make sure that we were on the same page. Like we have a regional infrastructure, but I don't really know what's going on in Arizona. And so the worry then is that Starbucks would sneak in something like an anti-strike clause, or, you know, try to have some stores waive certain rights. And then that would kind of fracture the power of the movement. And so right now there is a national bargaining survey that's going around in unionized stores to kind of assess what the priorities of unionized partners are and what a base kind of skeletal national contract would look like. That way, you know, individual stores can still have the right to kind of tweak things upon their needs, but just so we make sure that, you know, nobody is accidentally ceding, you know, the right to strike and things of that nature. So that'll be very interesting, especially since the bargaining unit before was store by store, how that will all shake out, especially as the movement momentum continues. So that's kind of where the national contract things are at right now.
Thank you. Emily, anything you want to add about the organizing store to store and beyond? And
Honestly, I think Gracie and Max really summed it up nicely.
Mhm.
I have nothing to add.
But at least let's remember to invite everyone to 47th and Cedar Sunday and Monday. Is that the big days, Emily?
Yeah, so I can't officially say like exactly what's happening, but essentially if you're not doing anything on Sunday or Monday, you should come to our store and wear your walking shoes.
Aha. Okay. Great. Anyone else? Other questions, comments? Well, I think we'll wrap this up. Hopefully, if I've pushed the right buttons, we will have a recording of this event, which will appear on the Eastside Freedom Library YouTube page soon, not imminently, but soon. And I encourage you to look at our website calendar of events for upcoming events and conversations. Gracie, Max, and Emily, thank you so much for what you've done to make workers' lives better at Starbucks and what you've done to educate and inspire us today. This is just really great. And thank you to those of you who have come, half of whom appear to be Maxwell's relatives, but what's the point of having relatives if we can't pack the house with them? So that's good. Thank you for Zoom. And thank you all. Stay well, keep making history. And I look forward to seeing you again.